the sort of title of the meeting is the history of anti-racism, which is obviously a very large topic. I wanted to stress a couple of things just in the title, really. One of them is this word history, which I think is very important because all too often things like racism are presented as eternal facts of nature, so to speak, you know, that people have got like, it's like a psychological condition that's built into people. People are hardwired to be racist. People have always been racist, you know. And that kind of argument that this is basically, you know, something unchangeable in human nature, I think has been used time and time again to either justify or excuse or come up with a reason for doing nothing about racism. And I would argue very much to the contrary to that racism and anti-racism are things that have histories. They're not fixed, they're not eternal, they're not the same throughout history. They change year in, year out. And understanding the history, understanding why racism was invented at a certain time, what functions it served, how it was fought, how it was defended, how it was defeated. Understanding all of that is really, it's quite important, A, to understand what's going on right now in the society we live now, but also to understand how to fight what we see around us today. So the other aspect of the title I wanted to underline is a history of anti-racism, because quite often we're again given a sort of a picture of history whereby back in the olden days everybody was racist and that was bad, but then, you know, through some sort of mysterious process we all became enlightened. You know, maybe a very good, clever person up top kind of said, hey folks, let's not be horrible to each other, and slowly enlightenment dawns upon us and we kind of, you know, rise up. Now this picture is not the case. There was never a time where racism wasn't contested or fought or attacked in some way. The idea that people just kind of accepted racism, there might not have been very much they could do about it, but it was never completely accepted. So in the same way that the racism and racist ideas and racist laws and policies have a history that you can track and go and pick up and understand and look at, there's also a history of resistance that shapes what goes on, which is all too often left out of the syllabus. You know, we're told that back in the olden days these terrible things happened, but we're not told about the people who back then were fighting those terrible things and actually eventually created changes that we see around us today. So with that in mind, I wanted to look at two points in British history, and just do a kind of a quick kind of a quick kind of analysis and look at these 2 points. You know, obviously there are loads and loads of different things I could have talked about when we talk about the history of racism and anti-racism in this country, but I picked these two partly because I think they're quite interesting, partly because they contrast quite a bit. The first thing I want to talk about is the anti-slavery movement of the late 1700s and early 1800s, which is, you know, perhaps something people just don't consider when you talk about the history of racism and anti-racism. Because if you think about the history of anti-racism, people tend to think of stuff that's happened, you know, in the last few decades or so. But actually, even as early as 1787, there was an anti-racist movement in this country that was absolutely crucial to the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery within the British Empire. And again, that's something that doesn't normally get talked about. We are told about how a Tory MP called William Wilberforce abolished slavery in 1807, or abolished the slave trade, and it's suggested that this is almost something he did single-handedly, due to like some incredible moral effort on his part, and the role of ordinary people and a mass movement, really, in abolishing slavery, tends to be kind of missed out from the picture. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is much more recent. It's within my lifetime, and that is the struggle against the National Front in the 1970s, and the birth of Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, and how a threat to all Black and Asian people in this country that was organised, fascistic, violent, was actually headed off and stopped, again by a mass movement of ordinary people who basically stood up and decided that they weren't going to put up with this. So I wanted to look at those two things. The second, I think, is a bit more familiar. People might know a little bit more about it. But I'll start off with the stuff about the anti-slavery movement. And I should say that everything that I am going to say comes from this book by Adam Hochschild called Bury the Chains. It came out in about 2005. It's available in paperback. It's a really good read. I'd strongly recommend anyone who's interested in this wants to find out a bit more about it to check that book out. So I'll start off here, and you might be wondering what on earth that is. It's a very nondescript courtyard in the city, 2 George Yard, and obviously it's just office blocks now. But the reason it's important, and Adam Hochschild's book really starts here, is that in 1787 there was a printing press based at this site that was run by Quakers, and it hosted the first meeting of the what became a national campaign to abolish slavery, and there were like, you know, a couple of dozen people in this room, and this was 1787. It was a time when the vast majority of people could not vote. Maybe about no women could vote, and about 1 in 10 men could vote. You had to basically be rich and own property to get a vote back then. So what they decided to do was launch a petition campaign to abolish slavery. Now, this is quite an extraordinary thing to try to do at the time, because the slave trade was making serious money. I mean, the city, as people will know, was more or less built off the profits made from slavery, and the contemporary notions of racism, you know, the ideas that different people belong to different races and that they're in a sort of hierarchy, that was really an idea that was took hold around this time. But as early as 1787, you had people who were basically just saying no to all of this. They were arguing that the slave trade should be abolished, not merely regulated or made more humane, but abolished completely. And they were coming up against some incredibly powerful interests, because people were making a lot of people were making a lot of money from the slave trade, but they pushed ahead with this anyway. And what they did is they launched a kind of campaign that was based around petitions. People would go to particular cities, set up meetings there, speak at them, and then everyone literate, anyone who could write, would sign their name onto these petitions, and these petitions would then be used to kind of try to force bills through Parliament and so on. Some of them were very large indeed. The petition in Manchester to abolish the slave trade was signed by about 10,000 people, which historians reckon was about 1 in 5 of the adult population of the city at that time. So it was incredibly popular, these petitions, and these petitions were mostly signed by ordinary working people who maybe a few generations ago had been living off the land, but had been driven off the land and put to work in factories in urban centres like Sheffield and Manchester and so on. So in that sense, there was a kind of a sense of solidarity and sympathy with what was going on with the slave trade. I'll just read out this something from the petition signed by Sheffield steelworkers, and this is really, this was signed by 700 metal workers in Sheffield in 1789, and they wrote, "Cutlery wares are being sent in considerable quantities to the coast of Africa as the price of slaves. Your petitioners may be supposed to be prejudiced in their interests if said trade in slaves should be abolished." They're referring to the fact there that the cutlery and metalware that they produced was what was traded for slaves in Africa. So, you know, you might have expected these workers to be kind of, you know, quite happy for their goods to be sold, but they weren't. They say, "But your petitioners, having always understood that the natives of Africa have the greatest aversion to foreign slavery, consider the nations of Africa as their own." So you see there that ordinary workers in Sheffield were horrified by the slave trade and did what they could and joined this movement with a great deal of enthusiasm. Other people in this movement, the guy at the front cover of this Hochschild book that I mentioned is Oladapo Ejiro. He was born in present-day Nigeria, but was captured and enslaved at the age of about 10, 11. Luckily for him, he didn't end up on a plantation. He ended up working on a ship, and actually by his 20s managed to buy his freedom and escape to Britain, where he joined the anti-slavery movement, and in particular wrote this book, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oladapo Ejiro, the African, which essentially was his autobiography, and he talked about the slave trade and what had happened to him. And he was part of this anti-slavery movement. He would tour the country, going to the various places to drum up names for this petition. Other things that happened around that time, you might have seen this poster before. It's a poster off a slave ship, showing the incredibly inhumane, disgusting conditions that people were chained up and put in these ships. Now, the reason you might have seen these images is that this anti-slavery campaign, the printers involved in it produced these images in thousands and thousands and sent them around the country. And this is kind of one of the first examples of a mass-produced poster, political poster, again done by this anti-slavery movement. You might also have come across this famous image produced in porcelain by Josiah Wedgwood, who was a porcelain entrepreneur based in current Stoke-on-Trent, who was also quite sympathetic to the anti-slavery movement and produced this. So like nowadays we think it's quite normal and quite common for political movements to have posters, badges, symbols, and so on. But all of this was kind of invented by the anti-slavery movement back then. One thing that that also happened was around that time was there was a boycott campaign, a campaign to boycott sugar. and in particular, it was aimed at the trendy new drink around that time, which was called tea. And with this campaign to boycott sugar, which the sugar was being produced by slaves on plantations, kind of branded tea as the blood-sweetened beverage and tried to get people to boycott using sugar. And it was, again, very, very effective. It was an incredibly strong propaganda term. The idea that people should boycott sugar as a protest against slavery, interestingly, did not come from the leaders of the campaign. It came from the local chapters, and indeed, many of the senior people in the campaign, like the MP William Wilberforce, thought it was dangerously radical to do an actual consumer boycott like this. So there you see a lot of ideas of that are now kind of taken for granted in political campaigning and campaigning more generally, were really pioneered by this movement that involved ordinary workers, it involved former slaves, it involved all sorts of people. And it eventually managed to abolish the slave trade in 1807, but just the slave trade. And there was various kind of lukewarm promises that something would be done about the actually enslaved people who are currently enslaved. But as it happened, nothing was done. These people who were enslaved remained slaves. So maybe about 20 years later, the campaign, the anti-slavery campaign, was relaunched, with many of the same people who are obviously much older now getting involved in it. And they were basically demanding the immediate abolition of slavery, so that all currently existing slaves would be freed. Again, that was considered a very, very radical demand at the time, but they organised, they got lots of people involved. Crucially, the news that there was a big, massive anti-slavery campaigning for the abolition of slavery in Britain, reached places like the Caribbean. So in 1830, you saw a major revolt against slavery in the Caribbean, and in Jamaica in particular. It was put down horrifically, but all of this contributed to an atmosphere where the rich and powerful basically felt that they couldn't afford to carry on using slavery, because there were revolts and uprisings in the actual colonies in the Caribbean, and there was a radical movement at home that was not just pushing for the abolition of slavery, but for all sorts of other things like the vote and so on. So in the face of this, they eventually abolished slavery. The bill was passed in 1833 to abolish slavery across the British Empire, and it was eventually enacted. It took 5 years for them to actually get around to doing this in 1838. So over a period of 50 years, you kind of see things go from this, a few dozen people in this meeting in this shop, in this print shop in the city, and deciding to launch this campaign, to 50 years later, after mass demonstrations, uprisings, revolutions in Haiti. Haiti actually managed to throw out the slavers altogether and take over the island. Eventually, 50 years later, the campaign succeeded. And in the process, I think, set certain ideas in motion, the ideas that injustices like this could be fought by ordinary people when they organised and fought, essentially, and used all the techniques they had to do that. I'm now going to fast forward a couple of centuries and talk for maybe about 10 minutes more about a much more recent kind of episode in the history of anti-racism in Britain, which involves what happened in the 70s with the National Front. Now, I can just about remember this. I think my earliest TV memory of watching the news when I must have been about 8 years old at the time, was seeing these kind of big demonstrations against the National Front, and being slightly puzzled by what was going on here. But the backdrop to this really is what was happening in Britain in the 70s. In the post-war period, there was several things happened in Britain. There was a long economic boom that meant that the standard of living for ordinary people in Britain got steadily better throughout the post-war period. There was also a major shortage of jobs, shortages of workers in certain key industries. At the same time, you saw the British Empire, as was, gradually get taken apart. More and more different countries fought for and won independence. And so you saw in the 50s and 60s the rise of what was then called Commonwealth immigration, which was basically the immigration of people from former colonies to Britain, typically the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and various other places, coming to Britain to take up jobs in all sorts of different fields, the post office, nursing. My dad came over here in the 60s to work as an engineer, for instance, from what is now present-day Bengal. By the 70s, that period of rising economic growth and rising living standards for ordinary working people had come to a halt, really. There were a series of economic crises in the 70s that led to a lot of turmoil, and one of the ways that people started responding was a turn to kind of a racist politics that would blame the things that were going wrong in the 70s on the Black and Asian immigrant population, who at the time had only been there maybe 10-20 years. And so you saw in particular the rise of this organisation, the National Front, who basically were a fascist organisation. They didn't present themselves as that. They presented themselves as patriotic, as good, honest, ordinary English, ordinary British people who were just terribly concerned about mass immigration and terribly concerned that immigrants were taking British jobs and so on and so forth. This presentation that they put on, this mask of being respectable, patriotic citizens, was in fact a mask. The people who ran the organisation, this chap you can see on the right of the picture holding the banner pole, his name is John Tyndall, and he'd been a Nazi, a fascist activist in a series of fascist organisations for decades. He was in something called the National Socialist Movement in the 60s. So, something that was literally named after the Nazis, and there were photos of him in, swastika insignia and so on. But by the 70s, the National Front was trying to kind of pretend it wasn't a fascist organisation, but just simply concerned with immigration, and would launch these marches. And there was a lot of rising tide of violence against Black and Asian people that was coming off the back of all of this. So there was essentially a kind of a certain kind of background racism that had existed throughout the 50s and 60s as soon as Black and Asian people started coming to this country in numbers, to be honest. And whipped up by politicians like Enoch Powell. By the 70s, this was really coming to a head. And you were getting these marches everywhere. The National Front started standing in council elections and getting scary high votes in those council elections, so they didn't actually manage to win any, thankfully. But the main thing that they did was organise these marches through immigrant areas to essentially try and terrorise the population there. Again, this wasn't something that people didn't fight back against. One quite curious incident in the mid-70s involved the guitarist Eric Clapton, who, quite off his face at a gig, started to come out with this racist ranting about how Enoch Powell was right and that there were too many Asian people and too many black people in this country. And in response to this, various people involved in really what would become the punk rock movement wrote a letter into the New Musical Express, basically denouncing Eric Clapton and pointing out that he was making these racist comments, but the music he was playing was the blues, which was invented by black people, and arguing that there should be a launch of a rock against racism movement. And that really started to take hold in the 70s, and it involved lots and lots and lots of small gigs being organised up and down the country, and these gigs would have a mixed lineup. There would never just be an all white or all black lineup. It would always have a mixed lineup, and they would raise money for anti-fascist and anti-racist causes. One of the key things that happened around about the same time, was what was called the Battle of Lewisham. I mentioned earlier that the National Front would march through immigrant areas, and one of those areas was New Cross, Deptford, Lewisham, that kind of area of southeast London back then. And the National Front said, I think it was 1977, decided to try to march through Lewisham, like down New Cross and then down into Lewisham itself. Now, there was a lot of argument about what to do in response to this, and a lot of people said, well, we should have an anti-racist festival, but it should be we shouldn't actually try to confront the National Front or prevent them from marching. So there was this sort of little anti-racist festival that took place several miles away from where the National Front were trying to march. But as it happens, and as you can see from this picture, the vast majority of local people did not want the National Front marching through their area and came out in numbers to try to block them and try to stop them. And this ended up in quite a melee, because the police tried to get to let the National Front march through, but they really couldn't, because they were just confronted by crowds and crowds of people, local black youth, anti-racists who'd come in to join the demonstration on the day, and eventually the National Front were blocked from marching. They couldn't get through, they couldn't go through Lewisham, and they had to kind of, go home humiliated. And this was really the first time. There'd been demonstrations against the National Front in the past, but this is the first time that people had actually managed to stop them. And it led to the foundation of the Anti-Nazi League, which organised very similar kinds of counter demonstrations around the country. And the Anti-Nazi League worked very, very closely with Rock Against Racism. So you saw that the two came together. One thing that was quite famous was this carnival that took place in Victoria Park in 1978. That was headlined by, this one here was headlined by the Steel Pulse and the Tommy Robinson Band, but there were a couple of these. There was one that was headlined by The Clash that was particularly famous. You might have seen this shot of The Clash on stage, and this this sort of sea of faces in front of them. Events like this were really kind of crucial in changing the atmosphere and the views of especially of young people around questions of racism. You know, in the 50s and 60s, you had what was called the Teddy Boy riots, which were essentially Teddy Boys, as they were called, going into black areas and beating up black people. So, you know, the youth cultures of the 1950s were quite racist, in a way that you know, elements of the skinhead scene became quite racist around this time. But for the vast majority of youth culture and young people's culture around that time, the punk movement, reggae, things like that, swung very much into the opposite camp and into the anti-racist and anti-fascist camp. And the effect of organisations like Rock Against Racism in doing that, I don't think can be underestimated. In the years that followed this, in the decade that followed, which was really the 1980s, I mean, I was 10 years old at the beginning of the 1980s and at school, and 20 years old and at university by the end of it. And throughout that decade, I think something really changed. In that while my memory of growing up in the 70s was one of constant racial abuse, constant racial harassment, a constantly being told that you should be sent back, you should go home, that there were too many unemployed people in Britain and that we were taking jobs and so on. This kind of permanent threat that we would be deported or something like that. But that was still around at the beginning of the 80s. By the end of the 80s, that had changed, and the Black and Asian populations of Britain were kind of understood to be here to stay. And even the far right and the fascist organisations kind of started to drop the talk of deportation just kind of disappeared. It was also a decade where there were uprisings against the police, the Brixton riots. There were big changes at the top of society. The 1987 election, the 1987 general election saw the first batch of Black and Asian MPs for many decades. So there's a real change in the culture of Britain around this decade, and I don't think that change happens just because of, you know, the natural flow of history. I think the fact that there were these huge struggles in the 1970s and late 70s, that masses of people came out to confront the National Front and break them as an organisation. By 1979, the National Front found that it couldn't organise, couldn't meet, couldn't march. Whatever it tried to do, people would come out and block it and prevent them from operating. So they were almost physically smashed as an organisation. They just couldn't function anymore, and so they splintered apart and disappeared, basically. And I think that the smashing of the National Front in the late 70s really made a big difference in terms of people's consciousness, in terms of people realising that racism could be fought and it could be defeated. The late great black radical Douglas Howard, who some of you may have heard of, talked about how he had 5 children, and the youngest of those children grew up after the Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, and he talked about how that youngest child was the first of his children to grow up in Britain and feel that the country was hers, and that she belonged there, and that the struggles of the late 70s have been crucial in changing that kind of perspective. So yeah, I'll end there really. As I said, I picked out these 2 kind of episodes almost at random, just because they were both I thought they were both quite interesting, and they tell you something about they're kind of turning points in the history of racism and anti-racism in this country. Even though they're separated by hundreds and hundreds of years, they do have one thing in common, which is that they involved a mass campaigning. It involved getting ordinary people out in their hundreds and thousands and getting them involved in a fight against racism. And I do think that's really important. Far too often we're kind of told that this is that racism is something we have to be educated out of by people above us, by people who are cleverer or richer or more senior than us. And I think it's really important to remember that at every single point where racism has been fought and defeated, it's been ordinary people doing that. It hasn't been something that's been licensed from above. It hasn't been something that has come because of just, you know, some sort of flash of morality at the top of society. Those changes happen because people fight for them, and it's a spirit that I think animates the Black Lives Matter protests and the things you see today, and it's a spirit that will continue to resonate as long as racism remains to be fought. I'll stop at that.